Welcome everyone to the section sync for the analytics section on the 11th of September. I think I only have the only topic here for today. I just wanted to quickly share something that came out of a discussion from a MR that Dennis did to the analytics configurator and potentially affects our the infrastructure that we create quite a bit. And so I think it's important that we kind of raise awareness about this before we change it, and everyone also understands what this would mean and can give feedback on what they think about it, or if there's any doubts or potential problems that anyone can foresee. I'm going to share my screen just to kind of visualize what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to reiterate this in detail, but I think most of you probably have heard about beforehand that we're going to need to change a few things to support ClickHouse Cloud. We had this topic beforehand that ClickHouse Cloud is going to be necessary for our production clusters on GitLab.com. Because this allows us to get through security review quite a lot quicker, because the actual database is then not managed by us, but by someone we trust, and which already went through security review. The problem with ClickHouse Cloud and our current infrastructure is that if you look at our current infrastructure, normally ClickHouse directly requests things from Kafka. There's a Kafka engine table in ClickHouse. So ClickHouse has the capability, in theory, to directly access a stream of events or kind of lines, log lines that you can see in Kafka, and import them into ClickHouse. However, this functionality, the Kafka engine table, is not available within ClickHouse Cloud. They just don't support that. In general, I think that's something that we need to be careful about, is that ClickHouse Cloud, in specific cases, just doesn't support things that the ClickHouse open source solution that you can host yourself supports. And the Kafka table is one of those, the Kafka engine table. So we need to find another way to get the events into ClickHouse. And the way that actually ClickHouse mentions for ClickHouse Cloud to get events into it, and that Dennis started to work on, is using a tool called Vector. Vector is created by Datadog. I think it's originally for processing logs or sending logs somewhere, but I think it definitely also works for our use case. And it changes the way the architecture works so that instead of having this direct connection between Kafka and ClickHouse, we suddenly have Vector, which takes the things from Kafka and then puts them into ClickHouse Cloud. There's also a difference that ClickHouse is no longer requesting something from Kafka, but rather Vector is putting something into ClickHouse. So it's just using ClickHouse's APIs to put things into it. And so Dennis created an MR to update our configurator to support those two different use cases. Because essentially, when now doing the switch, we would need to support two different infrastructures, which is this one, where we connect directly between ClickHouse and Kafka, and then this one, where we connect from Kafka to Vector gets the things from Kafka and then puts them into ClickHouse Cloud. And this creates changes in the configurator, because the configurator sets up the right tables and so on. And so the configurator needs to know about whether we want, which kind of architecture we want. And so the discussion came up whether we shouldn't just support Vector everywhere. So instead of having two different architectures, those two, that we switch towards a system where Vector is always running. And the only difference, again, is whether ClickHouse is running in a separate cloud or within our own infrastructure. But the configurator doesn't need to care. It just gets a ClickHouse API URL. And also, the rest of our system doesn't really need to care that much about where ClickHouse is actually running. If we have Vector running everywhere, the database setup, the tables and everything would be the same. And in essence, we have these two options. We can either say, okay, we want to support these two different architectures, one with Vector, one without Vector, and then we have to deal especially in the configurator and maybe also in other areas with the differences. Or we say we don't want that. We'd rather have one architecture, which is just this one, which would mean we have vector running everywhere. So it's one additional service that also needs to run, for example, in Docker Compose or in any other kind of stack. But since vector would run everywhere, the advantage is that vector actually has some inbuilt capabilities. You can do transformations of the events that go through it. You can, for example, try to send things directly into specific databases based on the IDs they have in them. So in theory, we could investigate using the app ID of a event to directly put it into a specific table so that we no longer have to have one giant table where everything gets taken out of into specific tables. All these things we could start to investigate. We could make vector an active component, whereas if we have the two different options, I think we would keep vector as passive as possible, just so that the two different environments stay as close as possible. I linked the issue for me to investigate this, but I'd really like to have everyone's questions or also feedback on what you think about this change. Yeah, since it would change our architecture quite a bit.
So what would be the benefit of keeping the architecture, like the type of architecture without vector, with just ClickHouse? Like what would be the benefit of having these two different options that we switch between?
You have one less service that runs in those, and so one less service that can potentially break, that can potentially take performance. So right now, I don't think we really know how much vector is taking when it comes to resources like CPU resources, memory, and so on. It's supposed to be lightweight, so I assume that much, but still, it's one more service that runs within those environments. And one more service is one more thing that can potentially break and that can potentially create issues. But yeah, that's the main thing that I can see. Maybe there's...
So it's about like maintenance work on making sure that it also works locally?
Yeah.
Because like keeping also ClickHouse would also generate additional maintenance work, right? Because we still will need to make sure that the local ClickHouse is working. And with Vector, we would be using the cloud ClickHouse, right?
Not necessarily. I think those are two different, that's a good point, but those are two different changes. So when introducing Vector in here, so within this, the current Kubernetes clusters we have, we can then still have ClickHouse run locally, because you might not, like, just to keep it simpler from a setup perspective, also to allow potential self-managed users who don't want to use ClickHouse Cloud to use the whole system, to be able to host everything themselves. So the question whether ClickHouse runs within the system, like within the same cluster or within the same Docker Compose setup, or whether it's run separately on ClickHouse Cloud, I think is separate to whether, or somewhat separate to whether we introduce Vector or not. When we introduce Vector everywhere, we gain the ability to use ClickHouse Cloud everywhere. So you could have a local setup within Docker Compose that connects to ClickHouse Cloud, for example, which I think would be another advantage of probably having Vector, because then you can just, for example, try out issues that might be specific to ClickHouse Cloud. But still, you can also add Vector, and I guess for the normal Docker Compose setup, we would do this, add Vector here and still keep the ClickHouse locally. Just so that not everyone needs access to it, to ClickHouse Cloud.
So it is possible to keep Vector as a mediator between Kafka and local ClickHouse?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is only one way. ClickHouse Cloud doesn't support the Kafka engine, but both ClickHouse Cloud and the normal ClickHouse both have the same API, which is what is used by Vector to insert things.
In general, I think I would be in favor of keeping the same architecture everywhere, because Well, there can always be stuff that needs debugging, and sometimes it may be related to vector, it may be related to ClickHouse Cloud. So you will need some tool to be able to detect these bugs or introduce changes in case they are necessary. Yeah, and just from my experience, I feel like usually keeping like a separate system just for dev, it also ends up creating work that we need to do, like maintenance work. So I don't know what others think about it.
On the topic of Vector supporting ClickHouse, local and cloud, I'm assuming it also supports a bunch of other database types and event pipeline locations that you could pass it through to other areas if you wanted to. That's a correct assumption, isn't it?
It is. There's wait a second, I can actually they have the concept of sinks, which is kind of where you put your the events, which is quite a list of things. I think it's important to note that in theory also Snowplow would support putting things elsewhere. So for example, we could I think in here you can, for example, put the events into an S3 bucket with Vector. That's something that also Snowplow could do directly. That's something we wouldn't need actually Vector for. And Vector is definitely kind of built around and kind of biased towards observability data. So also whatever you can see as syncs is more in the direction of observability. So you, for example, I don't think they support any other real data warehouse. There's but they support like something like Snowflake or something like that. But they support, I don't know, putting things directly into New Relic or into Datadog. Or so while that is the case, I don't know how much of an advantage this really is, because it's not necessarily geared towards our use case, where I think something like, I don't know, Snowflake or other data warehouses would be a more natural replacement for ClickHouse than the things mentioned here.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I was just thinking from a community contributions perspective, if when we open this stack up and remove certain things from it to allow community contributions, where's the areas that we might see people wanting to submit contributions to add support for their own architectural stacks that we don't currently support for them. So it sounds like Vector may be useful for them, but more likely it'll be further up in Snowplow sort of area that they'll want to make change, plug it in elsewhere, and skip the whole Kafka Vector ClickHouse route.
Max, you had one more comment.
Sorry, yeah, I was more questioning about whether or not this is a long-term thing, because Ankit's already sort of preempted my answer, because Dennis mentioned before I went on PTO something called ClickPipes, which kind of fills that gap, but appears to be in beta and is very specific to ClickHouse Cloud. Are you envisioning Vector being sort of the long-term solution to this particular problem?
From all that we know right now, that would be my assumption. But it's really hard to say, because I mean, ClickHouse can move quite quickly in certain areas if they want to, but they also sometimes don't. So for example, just to give an example, they, I think, added JSON support for kind of actually reaching into JSONs a year ago in some kind of beta version, and nothing happened since then. So it feels to me that the best thing we can do, especially when it comes to ClickHouse, is just rely on technology that's kind of established right now, and assume that's going to be the long-term solution. Then if something better comes along, we can still evaluate it. But based on that experience, I'd say yes, I'd envision it for the longer term, however long that might be then.
That's fine. I don't ask with any particular sort of expectation or preference in mind. Because I mean, if we're going to trust anyone to support data pipelines, then Datadog seemed like a pretty solid choice. That's fine. Yeah, the last I heard about this was that ClickPipe seemed interesting, but that was the last I heard before I went on PTO. So cool, thanks.
With that in mind, I'm fully supportive of us unifying our stack. The short to medium term benefits of our velocity, having a unified experience across the board and being able to debug early while we're in the early stages of this analytics, instrumentation and product analytics more well, related to this stack more specifically, I'd be more than open. Let's unify it and make our lives that much bit easier for the short to medium term. If we need to change in future, at least we've only got one area that we need to change.
Thanks for that feedback. I think I agree. Do we have any other opinions? Anyone that sees a problem if we were to go down that route?
I mean, the biggest problem is going to be performance, but we don't know. We have no idea what the entire stack's going to do once it properly gets some proper amounts of data being run for it, which is where the GitLab.com test is coming from, to really put some genuine data for it in any considerable mass. So wait and see. If it becomes a problem, we're early enough to be able to pivot if we have to, but I mean, it's Datadog. I doubt we'll need to pivot that much.
And I think one note regarding that, we don't know yet if it's possible, but if it were, what I think we should try to investigate then is configuring Vector in the long run, configuring Vector in a way that it actually sends data directly to the database specific to a certain app ID. So I don't know if everyone remembers, but originally, or right now, the database setup works in a way that give me a second and I can actually share a picture, I think. Let's put this. And then here to everyone. Yeah. So currently it works in a way that we always put everything into one queue, and then there's these materialized views which put it into the specific project databases. And that's actually, I think, something I'm more worried about becoming a bottleneck. If we have loads of views consuming from the same database. And with Vector, we have another opportunity to, instead of doing this kind of shenanigans, just directly putting things into the right database. So it directly kind of gets pushed inside of a app ID something database, which would then decouple databases much more from each other. And I think also reduce the risk that it's kind of inherent in these shared architectures. It's where like one customer coming in that creates millions of events, or that creates loads of events, leads to slowdown for all other people. And I mean, we're always going to have that risk as long as we have one ClickHouse database with multiple customers in there. But if they don't use one shared DB, I think that's at least somewhat reduced. If they are all kind of spread across databases, and within the database, we actually don't have anything that's shared across them. So that's an argument I think that might even go in favor of Vector, but it's still something we need to figure out if it's possible.
I assume going down that approach would also improve our vertical scaling, horizontal scaling, sorry, with our ability to be able to just span out new ClickHouse databases if someone's being a particular pain and causing a particular influx, or even, GitLab dedicated, and helping them get that set up and having their own dedicated area, although they may use similar architecture.
Yeah, that might be the case. All right. If there's no more feedback, then that's also it from my side. Thanks a lot, everyone, for attending and for sharing your thoughts. I think it's helpful when we kind of discuss this in a bit of a grander audience and make sure that everyone's aligned with those changes before we make them or invest time into them. So,
yeah, thanks for sharing. It's been interesting.
Thanks. Right then. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.